Welcome to our discussion of Texas in the 25-year period from 1877, the end of Reconstruction, until 1900. And during this period, we're going to look at Texas in the context of the New South. By the New South, we mean after the Civil War, there were many Southern leaders who clearly shocked by the defeat and realizing the relative economic backwardness of the South compared to the rest of the country, advocated adoption of modern techniques in agriculture and industry. And then we'll also look at the Populist Revolt. This was a revolt. Well, it wasn't a violent revolt, but it was a political revolt against the two-party system, the Republicans and Democrats, and it was based largely on the needs of the farmers. Now, over this 25-year period, throughout the United States, both industrial and agricultural production, the rate of growth exceeded that of the population. And this was due largely to improvements in technology in both sectors. We look at this chart here, which at first glance may be confusing, but it goes from 1865, the end of the Civil War, to 1900. The red line that you see increasing steadily over the period is population. So that's the rate of increase of population. The line at the very top, the purple color, is corn production. And you can see it's moving in an up and down fashion. But if you look at the trend line over this period of time, it's definitely increasing at a fast rate. And in fact, the slope of that line is much faster than population growth. So corn production per person in the United States was increasing. The blue line is the number of miles of railroads. You can see major increase over the period. And finally, the green line at the bottom is an index for manufacturing production. Again, even though it goes down a few years, the general trend is great increase in industrial production. Well, we won't go in this course into much detail about the innovations behind this, but if you just think of some of the innovations, this was a period of the so-called Second Industrial Revolution. And now machines are based increasingly on the use of electricity. Electric motors are in pumps and on farms and whatnot. In the 1790s, there were only 276 new inventions in the United States that were registered for patents. 100 years later, in the 1890s, the period we're looking at here, there were about 1,000 as many inventions, or 235,000 new patents. And many of these were related to new uses of electricity, from the electric light bulb to electric generators, electric pumps, all sorts of devices. Barbed wire was one of these. We discussed this in the last lecture. It doesn't seem very high tech, but as we saw in the last lecture, it had a major impact in the agricultural sector in Texas and elsewhere. We had refrigerated railroad cars, which allowed fresh meat to be transported, as well as products such as fresh milk and cheese. Trains were greatly improved by the development of air brakes, a new technology which allowed the train driver or engineer to stop the train with all the cars braking simultaneously and at the right speeds. Previously, the braking systems were done manually by many men in the train, and sometimes someone would slow down one car too much or not enough, and the whole train would fall off the tracks, resulting in many deaths. The sewing machine was a major development. The first ones were not electric, but manually powered. A person's foot would go up and down. And then, of course, they became electrically powered in homes, and they were driven by large steam engines in the large factories. And there was all sorts of industrial machinery. There were also many developments in the agricultural sector, and part of this flowed from new technologies. For instance, for harvesting crops, you had mechanical reapers, which at first were pulled behind teams of horses, and the reaper would go by and the blades would cut the wheat or whatnot. And then later they were replaced by tractors. Refrigerated railroad cars we already talked about. There were also, of course, electric irrigation pumps. There were also many basic scientific advances that allowed agriculture to become more productive. And one of these was a much better understanding of the nutritional needs of plants, and that allowed for the development of better fertilizers, both natural, organic, what we'd call today fertilizers, or chemical fertilizers. For instance, it was established that plants need nitrogen in large quantities, and one of the natural ways to provide nitrogen to the soil, and this is still being used today, is after planting the crop they're going to sell, they would plant the field with some sort of bean, and the bean plants absorb nitrogen from the air, and after all, the air we breathe is about 80% nitrogen, and the nitrogen would go through the roots of the plant and be absorbed into the soil. They call those nitrogen-fixing plants, and that's considered an organic way to fertilize the fields. Or, of course, they developed artificial sources of nitrogen and other nutrients. And the scientists working with agricultural engineers developed better methods of planting crops, different angles to plow the fields, et cetera, et cetera. And we saw in the last lecture the commercial cattle industry really was developed during this period of time. Particularly useful for Texas was the development of cottonseed oil. You'll recall from our discussion of Eli Whitney's cotton gin, the purpose of the cotton gin was to comb through the cotton balls and remove the seeds, which were just thrown away. But then it was determined that the cotton seeds have a high content of nitrogen. So they were throwing away a wonderful fertilizer. So those cotton seeds were crushed and they were used in fertilizers. Also, they were mixed with food and given to animals. And finally, the cottonseed oil produces a very high quality lubricant for machinery. And in fact, in Texas by 1900, there were over 100 cottonseed mills to process these products from cotton seeds. Now, much more land in Texas was cultivated over this 25-year period, and in fact, the area in cultivation increased from 3 to 20 million acres. We can see on these two maps the increase in agricultural land under agricultural development. The top map is 1860. The areas in green are improved. They're being used for farming. And you can see in the case of Texas, there was a great increase, and much of that increase was to the west, and that was basically due to better irrigation systems. So now we have, for the reasons I just mentioned, a huge increase in agricultural production, but with demand the same as you learned in basic economics, that drives the prices down. And so over this entire period of time, there was a general drop in prices for cotton, corn, and wheat. And this was really bad news for many farmers who had borrowed money, and then they had to repay the money by selling their crops. So if they borrowed money early in the year expecting their crop to sell at a certain price, but then the price keeps going down, they're obviously not going to earn as much money. And so they go badly into debt. This chart shows this phenomenon very, very well, I think. Again, this is period from 1868 to 1900. You can basically think of it from the Civil War to 1900. The top green line, the cotton prices, and you can see it's a very squiggly line going up and down, but I've drawn in red there the trend line, and you can see the trend line is decreasing significantly over the period. The middle line, the purple line, is wheat, and the bottom line is corn. And you'll recall how Texas farmers had tended to specialize in cotton, so they were particularly badly hit by this. Well, in the South in general, not just Texas, there were very, very few banks. And this is a problem for farmers because they need to borrow money. They have to borrow money to buy food, to buy clothing for themselves and their family, to buy the tools and the seeds they need to plant their crops. And then they don't have any income until the harvest in the late summer or the fall. So, and what people would do is, if they could find a bank to lend money or a person to lend money, they would pledge or sign a contract to give a certain portion of their crop as credit. And there were two large categories of these. The first are called sharecroppers. As the name suggests, they gave a share of their crop to the person who'd lent the money. Now, sharecroppers did not work on their own land, so they worked on someone else's land. And in many cases, in fact, most cases for the blacks, when freedom came, they remained on the plantations where they had worked before. They often worked for their former owner as an employee. And so they worked the land that was owned by someone else. They lived in housing provided by the owner of the land. And the seed, tools, and everything were provided by the owner. And the blacks generally kept about 50% of the crop. Now, the other category are share tenants, and these were largely white. They were able to keep 60% of the crop, but they had to buy the seeds and equipment every year. But again, they lived in housing provided by the landowner. And the South in general, as we saw the last 30 years of slavery had focused on cotton production, and now the South is devastated by the falling prices of cotton. And it's important to realize, and I'll show you a map in a minute, in many other regions of the country, including California and many of the northern states, farmers worked with similar tenant or sharecropper systems. Now, in the 1870s, 70% of the farmers in Texas were working on land that belonged to someone else. Now, some have called this economic slavery, in the sense that the sharecroppers, whether they're poor whites or blacks, really have no alternative. They just can't pick up and move on because they're perpetually in debt. Because with falling cotton prices, they never make enough money to pay what they owe the owner. And what they owe the owner, not only a share of the crop, but they also usually bought food and clothing through the landowner, and that was at higher prices than in a nearby city or somewhere. And so they were constantly in debt. Or in addition to economic slavery, it's sometimes referred to as debt peonage. This is a photo taken on a cotton farm here in Texas, and you can see the overseer who's white, and the people picking the cotton, the farmers, are black. This is the map I promised you. This is showing sharecropping and tenant farming from the 1880s, the 1900, throughout the United States. And the color of each state represents the percentage of all farmers in that state who are engaged in tenant farming or sharecropping. And the dark green is over 55%, and you can see that in the deep south there, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. The slightly lighter green is 40 to 55%, and that includes Texas. And then if you look also in the, I guess it's yellowish green, the lightest of the greens, that's 20 to 39% of all farmers. And you can see, again, it includes California and much of the Midwest, in fact, up through the state of New York. Now let's look at the South as a whole just quickly in 1900, 35 years after the end of the Civil War. For the whites in the South, and this includes Texas in this figure, but this is the South as a whole, the whites' average annual income was only about half of that of whites in other places in the country, either the North or the West. 11% of the whites in the South were illiterate, and that was twice the national average for whites. So the whites in the South were not doing well relative to the West and the North. Now for blacks, it's much, much worse. Black income in the South was about a third the income of Southern whites. And remember, Southern whites are relatively poor compared to the rest of the country. And a whopping 50%, about half of the blacks, are illiterate, and that's 5 times higher than the rate for whites in the South. Now, we talked about agricultural prices going down, how that devastates many farmers because they often have debt they have to repay and they're receiving less money for their crops. And even without debt, they're receiving less money. So for anything they want to buy, they don't produce on the farm. They simply can't buy as much. But the agricultural prices helped those in the cities, and the cities were growing rapidly in the northern part of the United States, and the people there could buy much more food for $1. But this becomes a significant political issue in the 1890s, as we'll see, as many farmers protest the rates, and they particularly focus on the railroads because many railroads are charging very high fees, and obviously the farmers have to rely on the railroads to transport their products to markets to sell. Now in Texas, in the New South, you had significant railroad construction. You had urbanization, moving to cities, never any cities as large, of course, as Chicago or New York City, but for the first time we're seeing fairly major cities in Texas, and you also have the development of some industry. Now, in terms of the railroads, by the end of the 1880s, all the major cities in Texas were connected to the national railways, and there were in fact now more than 8,000 miles of new train tracks in the state. Now, the state gave land to the railroads. Remember, the state owned the public land in Texas, gave not just the land for the railroad tracks itself, but large tracks on the sides of the railroads. And that was done as a stimulus to develop the railroads, because the railroads could then sell that land. And they also, they would sell it particularly because as the railroad moved, people would establish towns, or small towns would grow. And so the land owned by the railroads became very valuable. This was done, you recall, throughout the United States, in other states, by the federal government giving land to the railroads. This is a photo from a few years later, 1910, of one of the railroads. And you can see that in this case, the railroad cars are carrying a lot of lumber, of timber. These are cut trees. This is in East Texas, where the trees are being taken for further processing. Now, this map shows the extent of the railroad network in 1870, and you can see, you have to look around to find it. It's basically Houston. There's a line going down to Galveston, and the railroad doesn't go very far. It doesn't even go to Louisiana. It's very, very small. Now let's compare that to 20 years later in 1890. Here we have a significant increase in the railroad network, particularly from all of East Texas up to San Antonio, Austin area, where of course the vast majority of the population lived. But you still do have a few lines that go now out to West Texas, to El Paso, and then up to the Panhandle. Well, the construction of the railroad really increased the number of towns. And so some examples are Marshall in East Texas grew from 3,000 to 38,000. I forgot a zero there, 38,000. Laredo on the Mexican border almost tripled from 4 to 11,000. And Fort Worth went from 500 to 23,000. I forgot another zero there. So Fort Worth. And you also, at the same time, all these cities and towns were connected now with telephones, and they all had electricity. Unfortunately, rural Texans went many decades more before they got electricity or telephones. And in fact, some of the smaller, very small towns in Texas didn't have electricity until the 1930s. And someone living on an isolated farm may not have had electricity until after World War II. Now, in terms of large cities, this is a map, of course, of the entire United States in 1880. And you can see the cities in this map all have a population of more than 100,000. And there's not one city in Texas. Texas is also shaded in the lightest green there, the yellowish green, which means that under 20% of the population lived in cities. Now that's 1880. If we go now to 1920, which is 20 years beyond the area we're talking about, but the same general trend, you can see by 1920, Houston has two cities with population over 100,000, Dallas and Houston. And now 20 to 39% of the Texans live in cities, which are defined as a town with more than 2,500 inhabitants. Well, the Texas population as a whole tripled during the period we're looking at, from 800,000 in 1870 to over 3 million in 1900. And in fact, in 1870, Texas was the 19th most populous state in the U.S., and by 1900, it became the 6th most populous state in the U.S. And of course, today, Texas is the 2nd most populous state, California being the first. Now, blacks were the largest minority, about 20% of the population. And immigrants from Mexico, there were about 71,000, had displaced Germans as the largest foreign-born group in the state. However, that tripling of Texas population was largely accounted for by the immigration of conservative Southern whites from the Deep South. And they brought with them, as we'll see in a minute, their political beliefs. Now, if you look at towns of more than 2,500 population, the number went from 9 to 42. But despite the urbanization, the vast majority of Texans remained in rural areas, rural being defined as living on a farm or in a very small town. There was also a huge increase in the number of factories in Texas, although nothing like the northern states. The number of factories doubled, and production, the amount of production, which is a better indicator, went up by a factor of 5. And many of these industries were to process agricultural products, such as milling flour or taking trees and producing lumber from them. Also, there was some coal mining in the northern part of the state. Now, in some of the industries, workers got together in labor unions to seek better pay and working conditions, and occasionally there was violence, not as much as in some of the big northern cities with larger factories. And in those cases, the Texas state government, which throughout this period was dominated by conservative Democrats, they would send in the state militia or the Texas Rangers against the employees. Now, we've looked at this growth. As impressive as it may seem, it's not as good as even in the South, the rest of the South. And of course, the rest of the South lags significantly behind the nation as a whole. And one indicator of that is if you look at the economy of a state. Nationally, manufactured goods were twice the value of agricultural goods in most other states. In Texas, it was just the opposite. Agricultural production was more than twice the value of industrial production. Now let's look a little more detail at agriculture. As we saw before when we discussed the Civil War, there had only been a few battles fought in Texas, and they were largely along the frontier. So we didn't have this disruption of the infrastructure or burning of the farms in Texas like you had other places in the South. So now the farms were in fairly good shape after the Civil War. You had a population boom and the new technologies we talked about before. And that all led to greatly increased output in the 1870s and 1880s. However, because there were many more people living in the state, particularly with immigration from the Deep South, it became more difficult to purchase land. And so that was one reason the number of farm tenants and sharecroppers increased. Now, as we saw earlier, the tenants and sharecroppers had to have credit to either pay rent or buy their food and clothing. Most of the blacks were sharecroppers. Very few blacks owned land. Well, they had very few blacks. A few free blacks in other states had land, but in Texas there had not been really any free blacks to speak of before the Civil War. So you had virtually all the blacks move into sharecropping. And I already spoke before about debt peonage or economic slavery. And this is both poor whites and blacks because of the low crop prices. They could never get enough money to pay back all their loans. This is a 1900 photo of a sharecropping family, and you can see the big baskets with cotton they've just picked in the field. And you'll notice there are many, many small children who were also out picking cotton. Nationally, you had a divide that started during this period of time, urban versus rural. And it's also a divide between industry and agricultural interests. In general, the industrialists and the large commercial farmers were doing well in the country as a whole, but the small farmers were struggling. And this was due largely, as we talked about already, to falling crop prices. There was overproduction, and there was now more competition from other countries in world markets. And this particularly became true of cotton. Britain was now importing much of its cotton from its own colonies and was buying relatively little cotton from the United States. So this applies not just to Texas, but the entire cotton-producing area of the United States. And at the same time, the farmers as a whole had increased debt to banks and railroads because farmers were 100% dependent on railroads to ship their crops, and often the railroads would give credit to the farmers. Now, with more and more people wanting clothing, sheets and whatnot made from cotton, there was increased demand for cotton, but the smaller farms couldn't meet that. But the larger farms could, and they were mechanized, and they had modern technology, so they increased their share of the entire cotton sector. Farmers in particular criticized the railroads because the railroads, as I mentioned, were absolutely essential to transport their agricultural products to market. Farmers also criticized what they called the middlemen. These are the people who bought their crops and then resold them. And the other main criticism was the national monetary system, the United States, which was based on gold. There was a gold standard for paper currency. So if you had a $5 U.S. government banknote, you could go to a bank and demand $5 worth of silver, and the coins were made of gold at this time. So now we're going to talk about the populist movement. As the name suggests, a populist believes that they're reflecting the concerns of the popular people. The farmers formed local alliances to seek political action to regulate the railroads. They wanted to tax the wealthy more. And they wanted currency inflation by issuing more money. Now, many students don't understand how that works. When you have inflation in the economy, the general prices are going up. So, for instance, the prices of your crops are going up, or if you have a job, generally your wages go up. And that is good if you owe debt. If you owe a fixed amount of debt and your income is going up, whether it's from selling your agricultural products or working in a store or a factory, your income goes up and your debt remains the same. It's obviously easier to pay off that debt. This all took place now in the early 1890s when you had the economic recession or panic of 1893. And that was the worst depression in U.S. history. It lasted 4 years. And it really led to a climate of class warfare, particularly in the northern cities with workers. But you also see in factories, but you also see now the farmers, the small farmers, not the large industrial farmers. And the farmers, one of their main concerns was the coinage of silver. Now, the coins were made of gold. There's only a limited amount of gold then and now. But the United States had a lot of silver. In states such as Colorado and Nevada, there had been large finds of silver. So the farmers urged the national government of Washington, D.C. to produce coins, silver coins. And that way the government could produce more coins, which would lead to inflation, and it would be better for the farmers who owed a lot of debt. By the way, the U.S. stopped using the gold standard for the dollar in the 1930s during the Great Depression. And so today you have a $10 bill or $20 bill, paper currency, that is backed by nothing except, as the phrase goes, the full faith and credit of the United States government. So this is a poster from the time of the Grange. You see the top, it has 1776, 1876. This is the centennial. It's showing how the farmer is there and reminding people that the farmer feeds everyone, whether it's the workers in offices down below. Everybody relies on the farmer for food. Now, the Grange was one of the main organization of farmers, and this is one of their cartoons that appeared in many newspapers and Grange publications. So the railroad is the hated railroad because the farmers believe that the railroad charges far too much to transport their crops. And you can see some of the railroad cars have labels on them like extortion, bribery, etc., etc. So here comes the railroad. And who's laying down there? These are the farmers. And the farmers are laying down there, and you see the railroad, won't even stop. It will just run over the people. Now, the Grange was a national farmer organization. It first started off just as a social organization to exchange information, and then it quickly took on political advocacy. And it grew very, very rapidly in Texas, starting in the 1870s. It demanded that the state government cut expenditures. It wanted reduced taxation. And most importantly, it wanted the state government to regulate the railroads. The farmers maintained that the railroads charged far too much money. The directors of the railroads were becoming millionaires, and the farmers couldn't afford it, particularly at a time of falling prices. Again, this is a poster from the Grangers. It shows the Granger, a hard-working farmer out in the fields. Another organization like the Grange was called the Farmers Alliance, and they advocated many of the same things, but they wanted to actually set up cooperatives among farmers to replace the middlemen, the business people who bought crops and made profit by selling them. And so they set up institutions that would purchase the crops or the milk, whatever, from the farmers, the meat, and then the idea was they would sell it. But their idea really failed because they started issuing notes which the banking system in the United States refused to recognize. But this plan, even though it didn't really get off the ground, did stimulate membership in the Farmers Alliance, and so it became more important politically. Like the Grange, the Farmers Alliance wanted national currency reform to base the U.S. currency on both gold and silver. And the coinage of silver was often referred to as free silver. I mean, it wouldn't be free, but there'd be so much of it, it would be worth less and people could pay off their debts. But it also would hurt lenders, because if you have lent a farmer money or anyone money, and then there's general inflation and you're paid with inflated dollars, you're actually losing money on your investment. Now, the conservative Democrats, who generally totally controlled Texas politics during this entire period of time at the state level. They opposed these demands for a more active role, and they wanted a more active role for the state and federal government. This is a photo of the Farmers Alliance flag they had in Texas, 1878. Free trade, the most good for the most people, wisdom, justice, and moderation. By moderation, they're talking about the consumption of alcoholic beverages, which we'll talk about in a moment. So, looking at this entire period of time after the end of Reconstruction or redemption, conservative Democrats basically ran state politics during this entire period of time. And as I mentioned before, the immigration of many, many conservative Southerners helped the Democrats because they shared the racial and political beliefs of the conservative Democrats in Texas. Now, during this period of time, the Republicans never got more than a third of the votes in Texas, and they were limited to areas with large numbers of black voters. Blacks had not yet been totally pushed out from voting. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the fact that the Republicans received most of the black votes meant for the conservative Democrats that they just hated the Republicans because they were allied with the blacks in the state. And it's interesting that a lot of these farmer organizations or people who wanted prohibition of alcohol didn't join forces with the Republicans to elect candidates. Rather, they set up their own parties like the Prohibition Party, and they ran their own candidates, and they didn't have a chance of winning because they never united. Now, in terms of education, or higher education, there was a lot of progress in this period. The University of Texas in Austin finally opened in 1883 after many years of an attempt to start the school. And it was funded by the sale of land in West Texas, and also the University of Texas system still owns much land in West Texas. And of course, later they found oil on much of that land, and that was used to build up the university. Also during this time period, Prairie View University, now it's called Prairie View A&M, was set up in Hempstead, about an hour's drive out of Houston, and it was set up for black students because, of course, Texas was totally segregated at this time for education. This is the old main building at University of Texas in Austin in 1898. That building, unfortunately, was demolished, and they put in other buildings. But you can see how small UT was then. Now, within the Democratic Party, there were internal battles over prohibition, whether alcohol should be sold and consumed. And so you had what were called the wets and the dries in the Democratic Party. And in 1877, the dry faction, those who wanted to reduce or eliminate the consumption of alcohol, proposed an amendment to the state constitution for prohibition, and it lost, but 129,000 voted yes, 220,000 no. It lost by a large margin, but still it received quite a bit of support. And of course, in the 1920s, we'll see prohibition in the United States. But this issue between the wets and the dries was sort of remained in Texas politics at the county level, the national level. And the Texas Constitution does allow individual counties to be dry and prohibit the consumption of alcohol. Also during this period, the new Capitol building in Austin was built in 1888, and it was financed by the sale of 3 million acres of state land in the in the Panhandle in the north. The building, the entire structure, is modeled on the U.S. Capitol, but Texans were very proud it was even taller. In fact, at the time it was built, it was the 7th largest building in the world at the time. So even Texans then prided themselves on having big Texas-sized things, including buildings. This, of course, is the Capitol. If you haven't been there, you must go there. It's a very beautiful building, and inside it's very attractive. And you can see the rotunda. It looks just like the U.S. Capitol. Now, there were some threats to the Democratic conservative rule of Texas, even though Texas remained conservative Democrat throughout this period of time. As I mentioned before, the conservative Democrats sold public land to finance the Capitol building as well as state universities. The prison system was also set up on public land, not only land for the prison itself, but also land, agricultural fields on which the prisoners could work. Now, seeing what was happening in the state, particularly among farmers, the next Democratic governor in 1890 was considered one of the reformers within the Democratic Party, and he even received support of many farmers and prohibitionists. And farmers really liked his idea of creating a railroad commission. Texas was the first state to have such an agency that would regulate the activities of an industry. So the Railroad Commission, which exists to this very day and is very, very powerful, used to set the maximum prices that railroads could charge and also regulate the safety and other aspects of the railroad system. And his proposal led to his election as governor. And here we have Mr. Hogg. But the new Railroad Commission, the members of it, were not farmers who wanted to have low rates, but rather Democrats, and the railroads did not really reform much, and so many of the farmers in the Farmers Alliance felt betrayed that they had voted for Hogg as governor. But the Railroad Commission, as we'll see later in the course, became tremendously powerful in the state because it also could then regulate the oil and gas sector, which it does to this day. So what were Hogg's reforms? Well, he had some regulations on the railroads, not nearly enough for the farmers. He restricted the amount of debt that cities and counties in Texas could acquire. And he also greatly expanded public support for colleges and universities throughout the state. Now, this is a time of political segregation, and it's interesting, the populist parties, we're talking here the Farmers Alliance and others, they organized black and white members at a time when the main Democratic Party was whites only. And Governor Hogg's faction of the Democratic Party also supported some of the populist demands, such as reform of the national currency and election of the railroad commissioners, so that some farmers could be elected, but they weren't. And populists in general were frustrated with the national two-party system, and increasingly becoming so in Texas. Now, I already mentioned the economic panic in 1893 that was nationwide. It caused hard times across the country, including Texas. And in 1894, the populists ran a candidate for the governorship, but a Democrat again won the governorship. However, in the 1894 election, the populists did win 22 state representatives and 2 state senators, and they continued to have large rallies throughout the state. But now we're going to see in the 1896 national election, the Populist Party totally collapsed. So in 1896, the Republican presidential candidate was William McKinley, who represented the northeastern factions, largely the large manufacturing interests. And the Democratic Party, the National Democratic Party, chose as its candidate William Jennings Bryan, which is interesting because William Jennings Bryan was not a Democrat to start off with. He was the head of the Populist Party, and he was receiving significant support, and so the Democratic Party leadership nationwide decided to join ranks with William Jennings Bryan, and he became the Democratic candidate. And the thought was, well, Bryan would unite the farm workers and the urban workers in the North traditionally voted Democratic, so they would come in. Now, William Jennings Bryan was a very famous orator in American history, and he gave a famous speech in which he advocated so-called free silver, or having the United States government issue silver coins as well as gold coins. And so during this speech, he was very, very eloquent. He stretched his arm out as if he was Jesus Christ on the cross and said, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." So he was a very, very eloquent speaker. Well, 1896 is a very important and dramatic election because you have William Jennings Bryan speaking on behalf of the poor, the farmers, and greatly advocating much more federal government involvement. This is Mr. Bryan. Well, the election did not turn out very well for Bryan, even though he got over 6 million popular votes, and those are the states in light blue on this map, including Texas. William McKinley, the Republican, won more electoral votes and won the presidency. Now, in Texas, like much of the rest of the South, the populists all along were challenging the dominance of the Democratic Party in the state. But it's interesting, in the 1896 election, the populists in Texas did not follow the National Party, and they did not generally endorse William Jennings Bryan, but now the populists, after their defeat in the 1896 election, the Populist Party quickly faded both nationally and in Texas. But many of the ideas that the populists had put out, both in the 1896 national election and in other elections, many of those ideas will be implemented over the next 20 years, and which we'll see in our next lecture on the progressive movement. And these ideas are a federal income tax, direct election of U.S. senators, because senators were chosen by the state legislature, and we'll see many of those ideas become policy during the progressive era. Well, fortunately for the farmers who'd been devastated by low food prices, the prices of food soon recovered, really for two reasons. One, the economic recession that started in 1893 ended by 1897, and also there were very poor harvests of the crops in many other parts of the world, and so with less supply, the price went up. Also, there was some inflation. Now, you recall that the farmers had wanted the coinage of silver to produce inflation. Well, the same thing occurred to some extent because the nation's money supply rapidly increased because there were massive discoveries of gold in Alaska in the 1890s, as well as South Africa and Australia. And finally, a note on race relations in the South, and we'll talk a lot more about this as we move along. Well, until this point, there were, as I mentioned, many blacks voting for the Republican Party, and the Democrats in Texas, well, across the South, did not like that. And so the Democrats wanted to come up with schemes to stop the blacks from voting, to disenfranchise the blacks. Now, they could not put in their state constitution or laws that blacks couldn't vote, because that would violate an amendment to the United States, the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution. So they came up, Mississippi was the first with the Mississippi Plan, which was copied by many other states, including Texas, and different southern states had different variants of this. One of them, and it was implemented in Texas, was the poll tax, saying, well, there's a tax of a couple of dollars that must be paid every year by voters to pay for the machinery of voting, not actual machines, but the whole process of printing ballots and all that. And that made it virtually impossible for the poorer blacks to pay. That was a significant amount of money. $1 or $2 now is what, $40 or $50. $1 or $2 then was like $40 now. And some poor whites couldn't pay either. But since the election process was run by whites, if a poor white didn't pay, they were often told, oh, okay, Farmer Bob, we know you can go ahead and vote. There was also a literacy test graded by white officials, and we saw one of those discussed it in a previous lecture, and there's an example of one from Louisiana in Canvas. There was also a grandfather clause. They said, well, if your father or grandfather was eligible to vote in 1867, then you didn't have to take the literacy test. Well, what did that mean? Blacks didn't qualify under that because blacks had been in slavery, they couldn't vote, and by 1867 they really weren't eligible to vote. And there were many variants of this for almost 100 years now, until the 1960s, to keep blacks from voting. Well, the Democrats won in Texas in 1900. No surprise, they'd won every statewide election since 1876. And now we're seeing the populist decline. 1898, they only received 28% of the vote in Texas, their candidates, then 6% in 1900. And because the populists had brought in blacks to vote, as the populists declined, and also the blacks voted for Southern Republicans, the Democrats really became more and more interested in disenfranchising or taking away the vote from blacks. And as I mentioned, they did that in Texas through the poll tax. And another means was they replaced the system of conventions to select candidates with a system of primaries, and only white members of the parties could vote in those primaries. So that really effectively reduced the political participation of blacks in the state. Okay, in the next lecture, we'll look at the all-important progressive era, which is 1900 to 1920, and we'll see, as I mentioned, many of the ideas of the populists become policy. Thank you.